Now, what about the West? What about us? Well, clearly we don't have puberty rituals in the same manner to those I've just described. But there is still a response, socially speaking, from the people around you when you go through puberty. They recognize it. And they recognize that a person is becoming sexually mature. Adolescents themselves tend to have a response to going through puberty. Not just the physical changes I just described, but all of adolescence as a whole. Now, we have a ton of jokes about how parents have to deal with their child going through puberty. The attitude, the mood swings, the eye rollings. And this is not entirely untrue. It might be a stereotype, but there is truth to it. There really is a change. Sometimes a significant change in the parent-child relationship when a child reaches that stage, because going through puberty is bound to affect the young person's relations with the people they're close to, especially the people they live with. Not necessarily like in the movies, but it's not unusual for there to be a shift. Yes, the young person is adjusting to all this stuff going on, but the parents also have to shift their relationship with their child, their perception of their kid, their expectations of them, how they talk to them. It sounds hokey to say that as a parent, you have to accept you have to accept the fact that your child's growing up, but it's true. And what I'm going to talk about here is not absolute. It's not standard for everyone. There are a plethora of things that can affect the parent-child relationship and the degree to which they affect it, because reading this as a parent, of course, I relate it to myself. Some seemed bang on, some seemed somewhat accurate, but not completely, and some was just completely wrong for my family. To put it in a nice way, typically the adolescent and teen years present a challenge for parents. So how does the relationship with one's parents usually shift once puberty starts? Typically, it cools off a bit. They're not quite as close. Typically, there are more disagreements and sometimes outright conflict as the young person is figuring out how to be more independent, more of their own person, and how to be themselves as an entity separate from their family. Well, at the same time, the parents are trying to figure out how to allow you to do that while still maintaining some semblance of control, but not too much control, and trying to figure out how to still strongly influence you whether you want them to or not. So to me, common sense says this should not be surprising. If you consider everything that people at this age have going on, they're more irritable. They have more stress. Social pressures have increased. By this point, academic pressures have increased. And as a result, they're more difficult to get along with. So the young person may start being passive aggressive with their parents. I'll do it in a minute. They may start being very self-conscious and doubting themselves regarding their height, their weight, their skin, their hair, their smell, their clothes, their ability to talk to other people and not come off as a knob, in addition to a whole bunch of other things. They may start being moody. They tell you to leave them alone. They say, nothing's wrong, as they stomp to their room or slam a door or listen to the same sad song 40 times in a row, or refuse to say more than 3 words from the time they get home from school until they leave for school the next day. Think of all the different processes going on for parents during adolescence right until their child is in their 20s. So the young person is trying to separate ideologically, but also physically from their parents, usually wanting to spend more time with their peers at the same time the parents want to continue to be a main presence in their life. Combined with this are disagreements over what one is old enough to do versus what one is not old enough to do, and what they should or should not be doing. There may be disagreements over what expression of individuality is okay versus what individual expression is not okay. Haircut, hair color, tattoos, piercings, how short or tight clothes are, what kind of clothes are worn. There may be subtle or outright opposition regarding the young person wanting to live in their own terms versus living on parental terms, maybe even just when you're home for the summer. And there could also be disagreements regarding responsibility in a theoretical or philosophical sense, or in a real sense. But for all, not for all, but for many, parents and adolescents seem to be somewhat less comfortable with each other once puberty starts, especially physically. So in your textbook, they talk about a particular study that occurred that I found really interesting, where they essentially went into a mall and an amusement park, and they observed moms and their children, and they recorded how the mothers interacted with their children based on the age the child appeared to be. And what they saw, that mothers and early adolescents talked with each other more, suggesting that once you get to adolescence, you will be talking with your child more instead of being as physically affectionate with them. So again, why? Why is it that puberty tends to cause at least somewhat of a distancing between parents and children? And if you're waiting for me to give you an answer, you'll be waiting a while, because I don't have a definitive answer for you. As I just said, there's a lot going on at this period of life, and it's all concentrated. It's all at high levels. So of course, when the young person has a lot to deal with, it's going to affect the way they interact with people. In addition, there is this theory that physical distancing at puberty, at least regarding parental relationships, has something to do with the incest taboo. Meaning that once a child reaches sexual maturity, that there's just this kind of natural feeling that you shouldn't be as close physically speaking. So this picture of the two people on the beach, that's Stephanie Seymour. She was a very popular model, and that person with her is her son. And when this picture was published a few years ago, a lot of people had a ton to say about this. But I got to tell you, as a single mom of a son, I look at this, and what I see is the picture was taken at exactly the wrong time, like the wrong second. A second before, a second after, it wouldn't have looked like this. Personally, I see an affectionate mother and son, kind of made to look in a way that's not nice. Other people may see it differently, but I just want to present to you that there's some feeling that because we have such a strong incest taboo, that has something to do with the physical distancing between parents and children once puberty hits. In addition, where am I? Okay. We can bring race into this again. In some ethnicities and races, distancing at puberty is not as common. For example, in Latino families, it's not as common. It's not as common in single families headed by mothers. We don't find distancing at puberty in traditional cultures either. In fact, in traditional cultures, girls tend to grow closer to their mothers after puberty and usually spend much of their day with them working. So again, why is it in westernized cultures such as our own that there's a greater distancing between parents and children when children reach puberty? I can't really give you an exact answer. If we look at personal responses to puberty, well, how the people going through it respond to it. As I've said, with girls, the main number one sign of puberty is when they begin to menstruate. And this is sudden. There's no either or. Other developments occur over time, but when you get your period, you either have it or you don't. And if you do, it can't be denied. Now, even though, like I said, we don't have rituals as other countries and cultures do, getting your period for the first time does signify something, because it is the beginning of reproductive maturity. So although in Western culture we don't associate menarche with sexuality so automatically, that is what it means. From a research point of view, because of this, it's really easy to identify exactly when a girl is going to start puberty. But for boys, when they first begin to ejaculate, that is also significant regarding puberty, but it has been researched far, far less. In part because of its relation to masturbation, which is considered a taboo topic for many Western cultures. And in part, as I've already said, boys don't need to talk to somebody about it, whereas girls need supplies. How do girls typically respond to menstruation? Well, before I even comment on that, there has been actual research conducted about this in American society. With this in mind, at least in Western society, girls tend to respond positively. It makes them feel more grown up. Getting their period for the first time might provide them a reassurance that they're in sync with their peers. But it hasn't always been this way, in part because of biology and in part because of culture. Throughout the 19th century, talking about getting your period with a girl was absolutely, completely taboo. Completely inappropriate. Not that it's like a regular topic of dinner conversation now, but then even a mother would regularly not speak to her daughter about it. She just didn't. In 1895, a study was completed of high school girls in Boston. So just take note, if you're attending high school in 1895 and you're female, you must come from an upper class family. And of those who were studied, 60% had absolutely no knowledge about what menstruation was before it happened to them. So, I want you to imagine for a moment, and I'm not making a joke out of this, that one day you begin to feel unwell, and you begin to cramp, and then you begin to bleed slowly. A girl might actually think she was ill or damaged somehow internally. Because for those of you who are male, so you wouldn't know this, there is real physical discomfort. In general, your stomach doesn't feel well, and there's cramping that ranges from mildly uncomfortable to somewhat truly painful, especially when you first start to menstruate. So, not having any information at all, the girl begins to lose blood from a place she's never bled from before. It must have been really, really alarming. Just like the story in the textbook, where the Egyptian woman talks about her total lack of knowledge. Now, from our perspective, we look at this and we're like, what were their mothers thinking? What did their mom or a sister or somebody talk to these girls to prepare them for it so they know everything is okay? And also practically, so they would know to keep some supplies handy and not have an embarrassing accident. Well, this didn't happen because the middle class of that era felt they had a duty to protect the sexual innocence of girls for as long as they could. And this sexual innocence was very, very closely linked at the time to menstruation. Now, if you happen to grow up in rural areas on farms and thus cared for animals and observed animals regularly, you would have more of an idea what it was all about because frankly, on a farm, you're dealing with the animals reproducing all the time and animals don't wait to be alone before they're intimate. But the urban middle and upper class felt they had to protect their female children from what they perceived as inappropriate. And at that time, menarche was much more strongly associated with sexuality, at least in part because menarche occurred later and girls tended to marry earlier. So menstruating and sexuality, which was only to occur within a marriage, were simply more naturally associated with each other then than they are now. And it was considered of utmost importance to protect a girl's virginity until marriage at that point in history. Part of this meant sometimes attempting to delay menarche by having girls avoid sexually stimulating foods such as pickles. I'm not making that up. But of course, this had no real effect and it would happen anyway. Still, generally it was believed the best thing a parent could do was to keep girls ignorant of what would happen to their bodies, and in doing so, keep them ignorant of anything sexual for as long as possible. In the 20th century, attitudes began to change. Slowly but surely, menarche and menstruation became a more acceptable topic of discussion. So that beginning in the 1920s, part of earning the Health Winner Merit Badge from the Girl Scouts included having to read about menstruation and talk to the troop leader about it. It wasn't until the 1920s that mass production of sanitary napkins became popular. No, they didn't always exist. Instead, you would have used cotton rags or cheesecloth, which is a kind of cotton. So when sanitary napkins were mass-produced, this helped to encourage discussion about menstruation. And the companies would also create pamphlets about the process for girls and distribute them through the Girl Scouts or teachers during the 30s and 40s. In fact, in the 1940s, Disney produced a short film called The Story of Menstruation that was eventually seen by millions of American schoolgirls over the years. And then, magazines like 17 also began to provide advice on how to handle menstruation, how to deal with cramping and not feeling well and an upset stomach and headache or whatever it may be. So today, it's pretty unusual for a girl to get her period for the first time and not have any idea what's going on. In part because young people spend so much time with their peers, and especially with the internet because everything pops up there. And in addition, certainly in part because age at menarche has become younger, it's no longer so closely associated with sexuality, and instead is considered more of a matter of development and health and hygiene. So the further away it moved from the teenage years, the later teenage years, and the later people married on average, the less closely associated it was automatically with being sexually active. And this probably also contributes to why we find it easier to discuss it now. Even looking at girls being prepared for their period from a cross-cultural perspective, one journal of 14 studies across various cultures indicated that most girls have spoken to their mom about it before it happened, not when it happened. Now, if a girl should happen to get her period for the first time very, very early, then she may have no idea. I'm thinking growing up, the earliest I ever heard of somebody getting their period for the first time was in grade 4, which is pretty young in Western society. But even when information is provided to a girl, it's not necessarily considered something to celebrate. I mean, I feel odd referring to menstruation as a positive experience, like, yay, I got my period. But at the same time, it shouldn't be negative and it shouldn't be stressful. It's just something that happens. And we know that if it's presented to girls that way, it will more likely be perceived that way. So if they have negative expectations, they are much more likely to perceive it as negative. Traditional Chinese beliefs about menstruation are that it brings bad luck, that you shouldn't eat cold food while you have your period, that you're more likely to get sick right before or right after it. And this kind of creates a self-fulfilling prophecy for girls who are raised with that perspective. Self-fulfilling prophecy is a sociological concept that simply means if you expect something to happen, it's more likely to happen. If you go to a party and expect to have a good time, you're more likely to have a bad time. So same kind of idea. If girls are prepared for having their period like it's something really negative, they're much more likely to view it that way. And when you first begin menstruating, I mean, it can provide or provoke a lot of anxiety. So just as an example of this, I looked online at some chat rooms and jotted down some questions that young girls were asking, so you have an idea of what they're thinking. What if I get my period while I'm at school and have an accident? How much is going to come out? How much blood do I lose? And FYI, it's about a quarter cup. Should I use sanitary pads or tampons? How often should they be changed? Should I use something different at night? And I thought, as an adult, I found this funny. What the heck are wings on pads? Can I go swimming, sorry. Will I skip it sometimes? Does that mean I'm sick if I miss a period? Will other people be able to tell if I have my period? How do I know what are normal cramps and what kind of cramps indicate a real problem? That's a good question. So this is just to give you an idea of if you've never had it before, these might be questions that a girl would have. And as an adult, you might look at them and think, oh, that's a bit silly. But these are valid questions. So although we have these studies that look at a girl's response to getting her period for the first time, It highlights the degree to which culture affects their perceptions and experience. There still is a real amount of discomfort, physically speaking, associated no matter what culture you are from. Most adolescent girls report a certain amount of PMS, premenstrual syndrome, and that is the combination of physical, emotional, and behavioral symptoms that occur in the week before menstruation. Yes, there is a ton of jokes about PMS, and it's not unusual for someone to make a crack about a girl or a woman exaggerating her PMS symptoms. Oh, come on, they're not that bad. You're making it seem worse than it is. There have been quite a few studies about this, and it's estimated that about half to three-quarters of adolescent girls experience some level of discomfort related to their period, including things like headache, cramps, backache, fatigue, depression, and just general discomfort. The most common symptom is cramps. 30 to 50% of girls and women report having cramps. And something you may not be aware of is that when a woman is going through perimenopause or menopause, she can start to experience PMS symptoms again, even if she hasn't had them since she's a teenager. So I'd simply like to say that there's a really wide range of responses to menstruation, physically speaking. It really is like childbirth in that no two people's experiences will be exactly alike, and there is no possible way to predict what the experience will be like. At one end of the extreme, we have a very, very small proportion of girls and women who experience PMS so bad that it actually interferes with their daily functioning. At the other end, we have girls and women who have no PMS at all. We do know that certain things tend to make PMS more noticeable. A poor diet, lack of sleep, high levels of stress, lack of exercise. Yes, there's over-the-counter medications for these that do not require a prescription. And generally speaking, what a girl does is she tries a combination of things to see what works for her. So, I'll have conversations with girlfriends. I have one girlfriend who takes one Tylenol, one Advil, and then 2 hours later, she'll take medication specifically for PMS. Some people like just Advil, some people like just Tylenol. It really is an individual experience. So the experience of getting their period for the first time can be an ambivalent experience for girls. On one hand, it's a sign of growing up and becoming a woman and that you're not a little girl anymore. It kind of provides confirmation that you're growing up. It provides evidence of it. But the realistic experience of it is not great because of PMS, and frankly, it can just be inconvenient.